Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of math class. What we are going to be doing today is a review of equation solving. Today's day one. Tomorrow will be our second day of equation solving, and we're going to start it off pretty easy today. Go over two-step equations, talk about distribution and the distributive property. But like I said, today is a review of equation solving, and what I would like you to do is make sure that you have your paper in front of you, that you are following along with the video, taking notes. If by any means you need to pause the video, go back, rewrite or re-listen to anything, please make sure that you do that. Today, our essential question is, what is the goal of equation solving? So once again, we're going to talk about what are the steps of equation solving. How do I solve an equation in terms of two-step equation or an equation with distributive property? And like I just said, please make sure that you are following along and taking notes. The first question on your worksheet is, what is the goal of equation solving? And the goal is actually pretty simple, and that is to isolate the variable. So what we're going to write down is isolate the variable. And now remember, isolating the variable just simply means getting x by itself. So we want to get x by itself, or get x alone. The next part of your guided notes includes the two steps to remember in order to solve equations. Once again, we already know that the goal is to get the variable by itself, so our two steps includes add or subtract. So add or subtract first, and then our second step is to multiply or divide. And once again, we always add or subtract that lone number. Once we have our number with the variable x by itself, we then either multiply or divide to get that variable by itself. One of the big things that we need to remember to always do in equation solving is to check. And in class, we talked about checking using RSS, and this is no different. So once again, we're going to use RSS, and we know that the R just simply means rewrite. So we're going to rewrite the equation just as it is. The first S simply means to substitute. So once we have found out what x is, we're going to substitute that number into the equation, and finally we are going to solve, and our last S just simply means solve. So making sure that both sides of our equation are equal to each other. The following two problems we are going to go over together in this video. Once again, I would like to make sure that you follow along and write all steps down with me. So our first problem here is 2 plus 2x equals 12. And the first thing that we are always going to do is we are going to draw a line down the equal sign. Remember, equations need to be balanced, so whatever I do on one side, I must do on the other. The first thing I want to look at here is this 2 that is by itself. I want to be able to move that 2 to both sides. Currently, it's a positive 2. In order to get the 2 to move, I need to use opposite operations, which is subtract 2. Now that I've subtracted 2, I know that I'm left with 2x on this side, and I need to think to myself, what is 12 minus 2? And that is 10. The second step of equation solving is, once again, I need to get x by itself, so here I take a look at that 2x. 2x means 2 times x. If I use opposite operations, I know the opposite of multiplying is dividing. So I divide both sides by 2. That lets me get x by itself, and I know that 10 divided by 2 is simply 5. I circle my answer, and in terms of equation solving, I am done. Now, once again, I want to make sure that I always check. So I start by writing my first R, which is simply just to rewrite my equation. So I would say 2 plus 2x equals 12. My second step is to substitute, or S, and I know now that x equals 5. So I'm going to plug in x, or I'm going to plug in 5 for x. And my last step is to simply just solve. So I need to think to myself, 2 times 5 is 10, plus 2 is 12. And if both sides of my equal sign are the same, in this case 12 equals 12, then I know that I am correct. My second problem is pretty similar to the first one. This time we are subtracting, so I have 5x minus 2 equals 28. Once again, the very first thing I want to do is draw that line down the equation sign, making my equation balanced. And now once again, I need to think to myself, I'm trying to move this lone number. In this case, minus 2 or negative 2 is what it currently is. I need to make sure I'm using opposite operations. So the opposite of negative is to add 2 to both sides. Once again, these cancel, and I'm left with 5x equals 28 plus 2 is 30. And now we can move on to our second step. Once again, I want to get x by itself. 5x, the opposite of multiplying is to divide. I divide both sides by 5. And I know that x equals 6. Once again, I circle my answer. And in terms of equation solving, I am done. But now I need to make sure that I check. So once again, we know that x equals 6. I need to make sure that I check. So once again, I need to do RSS. So first R is to rewrite. So I rewrite 5x minus 2 equals 28. My first S is to substitute. So I now plug in 6 where x was. So 5 times 6 minus 2 equals 28. And my last S is to simply just solve. I know that 5 times 6 is 30. 30 minus 2 is 28. And 28 equals 28. So I am good to go. The next 4 problems on your worksheet is for you to do independently by yourself. Once again, I would like to make sure that you show all of your work. And then I also would like you to check all 4 problems. So please make sure that you write out RSS for each of the 4 problems. When you are done, the next slide or the next part of the video will then be going over distributive property. Hopefully you were able to go through those 4 problems of two-step equations pretty easily. Now we're going to get into something a little bit harder, but not too much, and that is, how do I solve equations that have parentheses? And in order to solve equations with parentheses, I just need to make sure that I use the distributive property. So once again, in your notes, I would like you to say distribute. And once again, when we use the distributive property, I know that when I have a number outside a set of parentheses, I need to make sure that I share the love, or that that number is shared with each of the numbers inside of the parentheses. So as an example, I have 2 times the quantity of 2x plus 3. I know that I need to make sure the 2 gets distributed to the 2x and to the 3. Now remember, we are multiplying here, so I would multiply 2 times 2x and 2 times 3. The example on your paper is 2 times the quantity of 3x plus 5 equals 16. And once again, we are going to solve this equation together, but we're also going to take some notes on the steps of how to solve this equation. The first thing that I always do and that I always want to remember is to draw that line down the equal sign. Now that I've done this, I can get into step 1, which is to distribute. And once again, all that means is making sure that I distribute the number outside of the parentheses to each of the numbers inside parentheses. So if you need to draw your arrows, that is perfectly fine. Here, I'm going to take 2 times 3x and take 2 times 5. I need to make sure that I simplify my multiplication. So once again, 2 times 3x is 6x. 2 times a positive 5 is a positive 10. And then I'm left with 16 on the other side of my equation. My next step is, now that I have a 2-step equation, I once again add or subtract. And in this case, 6x plus 10 equals 16. I'm going to look at this plus 10. Since the 10 is positive, I need to use opposite operations, and that is to subtract 10 to both sides. Once I simplify this, I know that I'm left with a 6x equals 16 minus 10, which is 6. The last step here is to once again multiply or divide. So we're going to multiply or divide. And 6x is multiplying, so the opposite operation is to divide by 6. And I would get the answer x equals 1. Circle your answer, and we are done. Once again, just to make sure that we are all good and we are where we need to be, we're going to have another practice question when it comes to equations that have parentheses. I would like you again to follow along with me and go through this problem. We are not going to check this problem. We are just going to simply solve it. Our first step, always, is to draw a line down the equation sign. And now that I've done this, I can distribute that 2 to both of my quantities inside the parentheses. Once again, we are multiplying here. So I'm taking 2 times x. If I need to think about it, there's technically a 1 in front of that x. So 2 times 1 is simply just 2x. 2 times a minus 5 or a negative 5 is minus 10. And I have 30 that remains the same on the other side of my equation. Now, once again, second step here is to add or subtract. Add or subtract that lone number. 10 in this case is negative, so opposite operation would be to add 10 to both sides. Once I do that, I know that I get 2x by itself. 30 plus 10 equals 40. And my last step here is to multiply or divide. 2x is multiplying, so opposite operation would be to divide. 2 divided by 2 gets x by itself. 40 divided by 2 is 20. I circle my answer, and once again, I am done. The last 2 problems on your paper are for you to do independently. Once again, you should be doing these problems on your own. You do not need to check either of these problems. I'm simply asking that you solve them. Please make sure that you show all your work. Use a calculator if you need to. And the last thing I want to say in this video is, if you need any help, please make sure that you check in with me. You can email me. You can send me a message and ask if we can virtually meet over the computer. That can be in a Zoom session or in a Google Hangout. Either way, I am available. Please make sure that if you need help, you let me know.